Switzerland's international cooperation promotes sustainable and inclusive economic development in low and middle-income countries. The focus is on promoting economic growth, protecting the environment, and ensuring social inclusion. Switzerland supports developing countries in several areas, such as transitioning to formal economies and implementing structural reforms at all levels, promoting the local private sector, strengthening public institutions, and improving infrastructure. It further promotes market-orientated vocational training and creates innovative impact financing solutions. Switzerland helps countries to gain a foothold in the global economy. Global challenges can only be addressed through coordinated action. But how exactly does Switzerland make a difference? In low and middle-income countries, access to quality vocational training remains a challenge. For many, adult education is simply unaffordable. And on top of that, many of the existing vocational training systems lack the necessary quality and relevance. Promoting future-oriented skills such as green, digital, and social competencies helps young people kick off their professional careers. Countries like Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kenya pilot projects are already putting this into action. In Indonesia, we are bridging the gap between higher education and the private sector. This equips graduates with the skills the job market demands. Switzerland unlocks economic opportunities for local businesses with innovative solutions. In Zimbabwe, for example, it provides funding and know-how to young entrepreneurs for setting up solar systems or growing seedlings sustainably. This gives them better access to the market. In Tanzania, a fish farm doubles as vocational training center for disadvantaged young people. Being a value-creating entrepreneur means taking responsibility for both people and the environment. That's why we put so much importance on respecting human rights and adhering to international labor and social standards. In 2050, every third person will live in a city. Switzerland supports urban development because cities generate economic growth and innovation. The goal is to build resource-efficient and comfortable living spaces with easy access to public transport, along with reliable energy and water supply. This approach will help cities better adapt to the consequences of climate change in the future. What more can we do? How can we engage further? What new and creative solutions? Let the discussion and the dialogue begin.
Let's continue with our program. And I am delighted to introduce Ministre, Monsieur le Conseil fédéral Guy Parmelin, Minister of Economic Affairs, Education and Research. Federal Councillor Parmelin plays a key role in one of the main actors of Swiss international cooperation, the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. SECO focuses on strengthening the economies of developing countries by promoting international trade, investment, and economic cooperation. A core aspect of its work is creating favorable conditions for sustainable economic development, supporting post-reconstructions, such as in Ukraine, and advancing sustainable finance. Monsieur le Conseil fédéral, c'est un honneur de vous avoir parmi nous aujourd'hui pour toute la journée, et je vous cède volontiers la parole pour votre intervention. Merci beaucoup.
Excellency, Madame la Directeure Générale, chers participants, un petit peu de variété, je vais parler en français puisque vous avez la traduction et on m'a donné l'ordre de parler en français, donc j'obéis à ceux qui ont organisé ce forum. En tant que chef du département fédéral de l'économie, de la formation et de la recherche, je suis particulièrement heureux d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. D'une part, nous nous trouvons à l'EPFZ, l'ETH, l'ETH Zurich, une institution qui m'est familière en raison de ma fonction, et je suis heureux d'être chez mon chef, ici, M. Meuser. D'autre part, les 2 prochains jours seront consacrés aux questions de la coopération économique au développement, une tâche à laquelle, cela a été dit, le secrétariat d'État à l'économie, le SECO, qui fait partie de mon département, apporte une contribution importante en renforçant le secteur privé et les conditions cadres économiques dans les pays en développement. C'est une chance que nous puissions tenir ce forum dans ce prestigieux bâtiment. L'EPFZ est un lieu d'accueil et d'échange où se développent des idées innovantes et c'est précisément l'objectif de ce forum. Ne vous inquiétez pas, cependant, vous n'aurez pas à résoudre de formules mathématiques compliquées pendant votre séjour. Vous n'aurez pas non plus besoin de connaissances avancées en physique ou en chimie. Venez simplement avec un esprit ouvert et critique et laissez-vous inspirer par les discussions et les exposés. L'essentiel est d'établir des contacts avec les autres participants et d'échanger avec eux. Ce forum doit ainsi contribuer à ce que nous trouvions ensemble des solutions aux problèmes urgents de notre époque. Nous avons tenu à ce que la liste des participants soit diversifiée. Des représentants de la science, du secteur privé, de la société civile et de la coopération internationale sont présents au forum. Parmi eux, de nombreux jeunes esprits brillants et pleins d'énergie. Profitez de cette opportunité, elle peut ouvrir la voie à de nouveaux projets innovants qui pourront être plus tard mis en œuvre avec succès dans le cadre de la coopération internationale et qui pourront améliorer durablement la vie de nombreuses personnes. Ce sont là, du moins, mes vœux. Et j'aurai plaisir, dans 10 ans, à ce que vous me confirmiez que les choses se sont effectivement passées ainsi. Permettez-moi maintenant de jeter un coup d'œil sur le monde. J'étais à Davos en janvier dernier à l'occasion du World Economic Forum et j'ai rencontré différents représentants de gouvernements ainsi que des dirigeants de l'économie privée. Je peux vous assurer que l'ambiance était loin d'y être sereine car c'est vraiment l'incertitude qui caractérise la vision ambiante de l'avenir. Pourtant, alors que certains l'envisagent avec inquiétude, d'autres se montrent au contraire plutôt confiants. Je ne peux évidemment pas vous dire dans quelle direction la situation mondiale va évoluer, mais permettez-moi de développer 3 observations sur la situation actuelle. Premier point, le monde est confronté à des crises multiples. À peine étions-nous en train de nous remettre de la crise du Covid et l'économie mondiale de connaître un rebond de croissance qu'éclatait la guerre en Ukraine. Ce conflit qui fait rage depuis 3 ans maintenant n'entraîne pas seulement des souffrances incommensurables, il affecte également le commerce international et la croissance économique. Les chaînes d'approvisionnement interrompues ont fait grimper les prix de l'énergie et des matières premières. À cela s'ajoutent des taux d'inflation élevés et un endettement croissant. Cette évolution nous concerne tous encore aujourd'hui. Soudain, en Suisse aussi, le mot « inflation » s'est trouvé sur toutes les lèvres. Et nous avons dû nous battre. Mais les pays en développement ont été et sont encore bien plus touchés que nous par ces regrettables événements, car leurs économies sont plus fragiles, moins résilientes. Dans certaines régions de nouvelles guerres ou de vieux conflits font encore rage, je pense bien sûr au Proche-Orient, au Soudan, mais aussi à l'est du Congo. En tout, plus de 700 millions de personnes dans le monde vivent encore dans une extrême pauvreté, c'est-à-dire avec moins de 2,15 $ par jour. Dans un tel climat d'instabilité, les défis sont forcément considérables. Deuxième point, de nombreux pays en développement se présentent aujourd'hui sur le parquet international avec davantage d'assurance et en étant pleinement conscients de leurs atouts. L'époque où les pays occidentaux donnaient le ton et où tous les autres suivaient docilement est définitivement révolue. Mon dernier voyage au Brésil m'en a apporté la preuve éclatante. Sur place, on nous a clairement fait comprendre que l'on n'attendait plus rien de l'Europe. De nombreux pays en développement et émergents souhaitent piloter eux-mêmes les évolutions sociales ou les innovations en matière de décarbonisation ou de traitement de l'eau, par exemple. Des pays comme le Brésil, l'Inde ou les pays de l'Asie du Sud-Est ne veulent plus simplement appliquer ce que l'Occident leur propose. Ils veulent prendre leur destin et leurs responsabilités en main, et c'est d'ailleurs très bien ainsi. Cela va de pair avec l'optimisme ambiant que l'on perçoit chez eux. Beaucoup de ces populations, relativement jeunes, envisagent l'avenir de manière plus positive, dans un esprit de renouveau que nous recherchons depuis longtemps sous nos latitudes. Troisième point, les fonds publics se font rares et la situation financière de nombreux pays est tendue. Les montagnes de dettes s'accumulent dans le monde entier à un rythme inquiétant, en particulier dans certaines économies avancées. Parallèlement, la situation géopolitique exige des dépenses supplémentaires en matière de politique de sécurité. En Suisse aussi, nous sommes confrontés au défi de réduire les dépenses publiques. Certes, nos dettes sont faibles en comparaison, mais nous devons veiller à ne pas nous retrouver dans la même situation que d'autres pays. Et la crise du Covid a parfaitement illustré à quel point il était important de disposer d'une marge de manœuvre financière. Une situation financière tendue conduit inévitablement à des discussions sur la répartition des ressources. C'est le cas pour de nombreux pays. Là où ils dépensent des fonds publics à l'étranger, la pression politique intérieure augmente pour que les intérêts et les besoins de leur propre population soient davantage pris en compte. Les gouvernements doivent dès lors faire des choix politiques difficiles en ce moment. La coopération internationale est par conséquent directement impactée par cette situation et elle le restera dans les années à venir. Il est important que nous ne prenions pas de décisions hâtives et que nous renforcions la coopération avec nos pays partenaires là où elle fonctionne bien et où elle s'avère efficace. Mais il n'est pas pour autant sacrilège de questionner notre coopération internationale. Les mots-clés à cet égard sont notamment focalisation, meilleure coordination entre les acteurs, augmentation de l'efficacité et mobilisation des fonds privés. En fin de compte, il est dans l'intérêt de tous, y compris des pays en développement, que les économies avancées reprennent le contrôle de leurs finances et que l'économie mondiale retrouve une certaine stabilité. Voilà pour la situation mondiale. La question est maintenant de savoir quel rôle la coopération économique suisse au développement peut jouer dans ce contexte. Et comme c'est le cas dans la politique industrielle et économique, nous voulons que la coopération économique au développement soit guidée par des principes libéraux tels que l'initiative individuelle, le libre-échange, de bonnes conditions cadres. La Suisse, petit pays enclavé et pauvre en ressources, est devenue forte et prospère grâce à ces principes. Nous voulons promouvoir l'esprit d'entreprise et la responsabilité individuelle et non miser prioritairement sur l'intervention de l'État. Il ne s'agit pas de laisser les pays en développement livrés à leur sort. Les inégalités entre les pays ou au sein des pays créent des tensions sociales et de l'instabilité. Et c'est pourquoi nous avons également développé en Suisse des instruments spécifiques destinés à compenser ces inégalités. Et je pense par exemple à la politique régionale ou à la péréquation financière nationale. Mais l'objectif principal reste de créer des conditions cadres permettant aux personnes et aux entreprises d'exploiter leur potentiel économique de manière autonome et sans soutien de l'État. C'est le travail de base que réalise la coopération économique au développement de la Suisse à l'étranger. En fin de compte, la Suisse en profite aussi à l'intérieur de ses frontières. La prospérité de notre pays, pays orienté par la force des choses vers l'exportation, dépend d'un ordre mondial stable basé sur des règles, avec des marchés ouverts et une politique commerciale libérale. Des chaînes de valeur mondiale diversifiées et stables sont une condition préalable à notre sécurité d'approvisionnement et à notre économie d'exportation. De nombreuses entreprises suisses souhaitent par exemple se diversifier en Asie et cherchent un deuxième site en dehors de la Chine. Des pays comme le Vietnam ou l'Indonésie sont idéaux pour cela. La coopération économique au développement de la Suisse y crée depuis des années de meilleures conditions cadres pour les entreprises et ouvre ainsi la voie aux investissements suisses et au commerce bilatéral. La coopération économique sert donc aussi de porte d'entrée pour de bonnes relations économiques bilatérales avec des économies émergentes, et ce, dans l'intérêt de la politique économique extérieure de notre pays. Ma devise est donc la suivante: la Suisse ne pourra rester prospère que si elle diversifie ses relations commerciales, élargit ses horizons, et dans le contexte géopolitique actuel, nous devrions nous positionner en tant qu'acteurs indépendants entre les puissances économiques établies. Je suis et reste fermement convaincu que la mondialisation n'est pas terminée, comme le montrent d'ailleurs clairement les chiffres actuels du commerce. Les mesures de protection, telles que les droits de douane élevés, les restrictions à l'importation ou à l'exportation, les stratégies de nearshoring ou de friendshoring, délocalisation dans un pays ami, ne pourront pas arrêter la concurrence mondiale. Peut-être que certains développements seront retardés, mais les innovations qui en résulteront seront d'autant plus autonomes. L'innovation et la compétition sont inarrêtables. Quelqu'un l'a dit d'ailleurs, on arrête aujourd'hui n'importe qui, sauf le progrès. Dans ces efforts, le secteur privé joue un rôle central. On trouve des entreprises dynamiques et innovantes partout dans le monde. Ces dernières stimulent la concurrence autour d'idées au service d'un développement durable, elles favorisent la croissance économique et créent des emplois. En travaillant avec le secteur privé local ou suisse pour atteindre ensemble des objectifs de développement, la coopération économique doit mobiliser des ressources financières supplémentaires. Et cela permet de multiplier l'impact des fonds publics, ce qui est d'autant plus important dans la situation actuelle alors que la marge de manœuvre des finances publiques est restreinte. Demain matin, une discussion intéressante va avoir lieu dans cette même salle sur la manière dont la place financière suisse peut agir de façon encore plus durable, et je vous invite vivement à y participer. Nous avons plus que jamais besoin de ce levier du secteur privé en Ukraine. La reconstruction est une tâche herculéenne qui dépasse de loin les moyens de la coopération internationale, et c'est pourquoi le Conseil fédéral a décidé d'associer le secteur privé suisse à la reconstruction de ce pays. Une enveloppe de 500 millions de francs est prévue à cet effet. Les besoins de l'Ukraine constituent la base de notre action. Les priorités de ce pays dévasté par la guerre sont, s'agissant de sa reconstruction, parfaitement complémentaires des compétences de l'industrie suisse. Et dans le cadre de nos travaux, nous nous concentrerons sur la modernisation des infrastructures de base dans les domaines de l'énergie, de l'eau, des transports publics. Et dans le cadre du forum, nous discuterons également en détail des possibilités qui s'offrent au secteur privé dans ce vaste effort. Venez donc nous rendre visite demain après-midi lorsque Madame la secrétaire d'État Hélène Boudliguer et le délégué du Conseil fédéral pour l'Ukraine, Jacques Gerber, s'entretiendront de ce sujet avec d'autres invités. Permettez-moi de conclure par la remarque suivante. Je suis convaincu que la promotion de conditions cadres et d'investissement mutuel est le meilleur moyen de lutter contre la pauvreté mondiale. Un pays ne peut se développer durablement que si les économies, et pas seulement les États, coopèrent entre elles. Cette coopération internationale se fait sur un pied d'égalité et c'est exactement ce que nos pays partenaires attendent de nous. Je vous remercie de votre attention, vous souhaite une excellente fin d'après-midi et un deuxième jour de discussion ici fructueux. Malheureusement, j'ai d'autres engagements et je ne pourrai pas être là demain, mais je suis heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui. Bonne journée à toutes et à tous.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Conseil fédéral. Et effectivement, on se retrouve un peu plus tard pour remettre les prix cet après-midi du IC Award. Et vous avez aussi raison, ici, on est dans un lieu de science, on est dans un lieu de formules mathématiques très, très, très complexes, mais on est aussi dans un lieu de musique. So music is an important part of the academic and cultural life here at the ETH. And today we have the pleasure of hearing a brass quartet from the ETH Big Band. It is led by the Roland Verny. It features 2 trumpets played by Ben Hale and Christoph Heck, and 2 trombones with Roland Verny and Sandro Müller. Their repertoire spans from classical music to jazz, and they also play original improvisation. So please welcome the ETH Brass Quartet. Thank you very much. Herzlichen Dank. Wir sehen uns später noch einmal. Dankeschön. We now have the privilege of hearing from a prominent figure in the international trade and development landscape. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Director General of the World Trade Organization. She has spent her career promoting global trade as a driver of economic and inclusive development. Before leading the WTO, she held key roles, including Vice President of the World Bank and Finance Minister of Nigeria. Her leadership focuses on strengthening trade rules, improving market access for developing countries, and promoting sustainable fair trade. Her experience is vital in tackling global challenges, including post-conflict reconstruction and economic development. We will have time for a Q&A session after her speech, so you can send your questions through Slido. I encourage you to do that. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, it is an honor to have you with us today. The floor is yours. Okay. We need just 2 minutes time for her intervention. So I really would like to encourage you to use Slido for your questions. It will be a great opportunity also to interact with you. We will have time not for many questions, but at least for a few of them. And also in the afternoon, we will, so welcome back. We will have the same opportunity, so see you in a bit for the interaction with you, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. I didn't run away. I'm just recovering from food poisoning on a trip. But I decided to come because I didn't know what Ambassador Bollinger would say if I didn't show up, or Patricia. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy to be here with you. Federal Councillor Guy Pamela, very nice to be with you again. We last saw each other in Davos. President of this wonderful university, thanks for having us. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to join the conference. At the WTO, let me start by saying we're very grateful to Switzerland. It's, of course, a generous host country, and one that is steadfastly committed, as you heard from the Federal Councillor, to international rules and institutions. But Switzerland also has a talent for brokering compromise and finding new ideas that can help move our work forward, which is in part what this whole event is about. So we hope, as I've heard repeatedly, that at the end of the event, many new ideas will come forward. Maybe 1 or 2 from my side by the time we finish. So as you heard, these are uncertain times for trade and for the wider context for global economic growth and development. We are seeing the use of both trade, tariffs, and trade policy as instruments to address non-trade matters as well as trade matters. The constant drumbeat of criticism about trade is troubling. Trade is being talked about in ways that make people feel uncomfortable and uncertain about the future. It creates uncertainty for business, as we've heard. And I think that drumbeat, for many people who also, especially young people, are not quite sure about trade, creates the impression that trade is more about problems than about benefits, more about costs than about benefits. What I'd like to do today is to talk to you a little bit about the benefits of trade, to tell you that that impression is not the correct one, that trade has been hugely beneficial and continues to be so. I also want to tell you that amid all the gloom, there are exciting opportunities that trade can still bring to make a difference for people and for sustainable economic development. Let me just pose a question here. How many of you know for what purpose the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which I head, for what purpose it was created? How many know? Put up your hands. I don't see too many. Do you know that the purpose of the WTO, as enshrined in the Marrakesh Agreement that created it, is to enhance living standards, to help create jobs, and to support sustainable development? How many people knew that? Very few. It's all about people and about the planet. And that was what attracted me to work for the WTO. It's about people and the planet. But wherever I go, I find that many people, especially young people, are not really aware of the purpose of the WTO and how attractive that is. So let me see if I can set the record straight a little bit and share some of these successes, but also the challenges that are before us. Now, we are talking about sustainability and sustainable economic development. And sustainability has many dimensions, but I'll focus on two. I'll highlight trade's contributions to economic growth and human flourishing. I will also look at the role of trade for ensuring that our economies can thrive within the environmental boundaries of our planet. On both fronts, there's considerable scope to improve, and I'll offer some thoughts on how we can do better. So let's start by looking at the track record of the multilateral trading system with the WTO at its core and its predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. In the decades following the Second World War, increasingly open and predictable global markets, anchored in the rules-based trading system, gave rise to a boom in trade and in growth. Expanding markets enabled greater specialization, scale, and competition. New technologies and ideas spread more rapidly. If open trade was vital for small economies like Switzerland to benefit from specialization and scale, it was transformative for developing economies with poor home markets. The open global economy meant they could now tap into external demand and ideas, using them to shift people and resources out of subsistence work and into more productive activities in tradable sectors. In his description of trade-led growth and development, Nobel Economics laureate Michael Spence said, developing countries were able, and I quote, to import what the rest of the world knows and export what it wants, close quote. Trade and output growth began to accelerate across much of the developing world. The results were dramatic. Over the past 3 decades, 1.5 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. Per capita incomes in rich and poor countries began to converge for the first time since the Industrial Revolution 2 centuries ago, until the COVID-19 pandemic unfortunately hit poor economies hard. As low and middle-income economies doubled their share in global goods exports, their share of world output increased sharply. According to IMF data, in 1995, advanced economies accounted for 59.5% of global GDP, almost 60% in purchasing power parity terms, whilst developing and emerging economies made up 40.5%. As of last year, these shares have exactly reversed. Over that time, the share of the world population subsisting on less than $2.15 per day fell from 33% in 1995 to 9% in 2024, according to World Bank data. This wasn't just about China, as many people think. If you take China out of the equation, the global poverty share goes from 27% in 1995 to 10% last year. It's also important to emphasize that developed countries benefited from the expansion in global trade. It wasn't just developing countries. Let me give you a few examples. Looking back to 1950, Gary Hofbauer and Megan Hogan at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., found that the gains from international trade boosted the U.S. economy by the equivalent of $2.6 trillion in 2022, equivalent to 10% of GDP annually. It's important to say this because a lot of the narrative now about trade in many developed countries, but also in the US, is that trade brought problems, took away jobs, not that trade brought benefits. So it's important to keep this in mind. Trade has even been net positive with respect to employment. The groundbreaking work led by MIT's David Dorn, based next door at the University of Zurich, and Harvard's Gordon Hanson, demonstrates that Chinese import competition resulted in 2.4 million layoffs in the United States from 1999 to 2011, with often devastating effects for local and regional communities and for people without college education. But other studies, notably by Robert Feenstra and Akira Sasahara, show that the growth in US merchandise exports from 1995 to 2011 generated 3.7 million jobs, and that services exports generated an additional 2.9 million. So net-net, the economy gained from trade. The problem, of course, was that these new jobs created were in different places and going to different people, and policies for mobility and active labor market support were inadequate to bridge the gap and bring those who were in places losing jobs to places where they could find new jobs. Turning to Europe, WTO research finds that trade cost reductions between 1995 and 2020 alone boosted Western Europe's real GDP by 3.6%. And according to OECD estimates here in Switzerland, over 1/3 of employment is sustained by exports. In Germany's much bigger labor force, more than 1/4 of all jobs are linked to exports. Countries in this region know their prosperity is deeply tied to trade, and we heard it from the Federal Councillor. When your ratio of trade to GDP is 136%, like Switzerland, or 93% like Germany's, or 70% like Italy's, you cannot pretend that you can do everything at home and reject the benefits that trade brings in terms of specialization and scale. For the EU as a bloc, trade with the rest of the world is equivalent to 46% of EU GDP. Perspectives can perhaps be a bit different in the largest national economies such as the US, where total imports and exports add up to only about 26% of their GDP. Now, with respect to environmental sustainability, the view about trade is almost purely related to emissions, and it's not such a good one. It's a view about the logistics of trade or environmental degradation from deforestation or land use. And it is true that logistics associated with freight transport, in other words, container ships, trucks, and planes, account for about 7% of global carbon emissions. And global demand for certain products can incentivize deforestation. We are all struggling with these effects. But it's important to know, however, that there's active work going on, serious ongoing work on green hydrogen and other clean fuels, as well as improved land use management practices to try and mitigate these effects. What is not so well known or appreciated is that on balance, trade has been a force for good on environmental sustainability. Have you ever thought about how you get green technologies from places where they are founded or made or innovated to places where they need to be used? You cannot do it without trade. Trade is helping to diffuse green technology, and with scale economies available from trade to drive down the costs significantly. I'm totally convinced that we'll never be able to get to net zero in 2050 without trade. And the notion of green comparative advantage, which I'll come back to later, is also something which we are discussing at the WTO, where a country can specialize in what it is green at and be able to trade it to other countries, and net-net the world will benefit by lower emissions. I'm going to expand on this, but I just wanted to mention it as another aspect of the way that trade can help environmental sustainability. Now, trade also has other benefits that go beyond the purely economic. In particular, trade has been a powerful shock absorber in crises, one that we cannot afford to forgo in our increasingly shock-prone world. During the COVID-19 pandemic, while we might remember the trade restrictions introduced during those chaotic initial weeks, remember it was cross-border supply chains that made it possible to manufacture protective equipment, vaccines, and other medical goods, including here in Switzerland, that could then be diffused to the rest of the world through trade. In the aftermath of natural disasters, trade is crucial for reconstruction and recovery, and you will see that playing out in Ukraine. That said, there's no getting around one reality also, and that is whilst there were gains from trade that are undeniable, they've not been inclusive enough. There were countries and there were people who were left behind. Even within rich countries, many poor people and places felt left out of the economic gains from trade and globalization and from technological change. And their resentment has helped to fuel the backlash we see against globalization. Far too many poor countries, especially in Africa, remain on the margins of the global economy, participating at most as suppliers of unprocessed commodities. Africa's merchandise exports have stagnated, worth about $613 billion in 2011, $13 billion US dollars in 2011. They're worth only about $600 billion now in 2023. The continent's share of world trade has been below 3% for quite some time. In a similar vein, the trade share of the world's 44 least developed countries, 32 of them in Africa, has hovered just about 1% for a decade. Low participation in trade and heavy commodity dependence are more than abstract indicators. They are strongly correlated with slower growth and worse human development outcomes. As growth accelerated elsewhere, the share of the world's extremely poor people living in sub-Saharan Africa rose from 18% in 1995 to 67% last year. But the exciting news is that there's currently a window of opportunity to change this persistent exclusion from the global division of labor. While the uncertainties in the international environment I mentioned earlier are serious, other developments create new possibilities for trade-led growth. In particular, South-South trade now accounts for a quarter of world trade, up from less than a tenth in 1995. Rapid growth in digital trade, specifically in digitally delivered services trade, create exciting opportunities within developing countries and for Swiss investment and innovation. Pressures to decentralize supply chains to build global resilience and reduce exposure to geopolitical, climate, and other risks should make it more attractive to invest in Africa and other places on the margins of global production networks. These incentives dovetail with demographics. Africa's young workforce will soon be bigger than that of all advanced economies combined. In addition, economic integration under the African Continental Free Trade Area is creating a unified market of 1.5 billion people. Bringing places from the global economic margins to the mainstream is what we at the WTO are calling re-globalization. I want you to remember that word. Re-globalization offers greater resilience in the face of changing risks and ever more frequent shocks, and the prospect of a world in which more jobs and opportunities at home mean fewer young people have cause to think about throwing themselves into rafts crossing the Mediterranean. For re-globalization to push into frontier markets, we need new de-risking instruments for trade-oriented investment in places outside current production hubs. Swiss companies could use their supply chains to push re-globalization forward, and they have room to be more proactive. According to UNCTAD data, for most of this century, only 1% of the stock of outward Swiss foreign direct investment was in Africa, 1%, except during the commodity boom of 2007-2008, when it reached 2%. These numbers are similar for Germany. 3/4 of Swiss FDI is in other developed countries. So I want us to really think about this. If aid is in jeopardy, as the Federal Councillor said, and I totally agree with him. I just came from Addis Ababa where I said to African leaders, forget about aid. We've got to change our mindset on the continent and reorient towards investment. But if outward investment flowing is so small, what needs to happen to change it? Because if you have neither the aid, you have not the investment, then what happens? So I'm also challenging the Swiss private sector and all of you here. 1% of Swiss foreign investment in this century went to the African continent. So I was asked to do out-of-the-box thinking. So let me, as I come towards the end of my talk, try. To sustain higher growth, Africa needs to add more value to its commodities. Many of the world's big commodity traders are based in Switzerland and could make a material difference in this regard. And I'll be a bit naughty. Switzerland is synonymous with chocolate. We already heard about the chocolate value chain, but you don't grow a single cocoa bean. Meanwhile, nearly 3/4 of the world's cocoa comes from West Africa, most of it exported in raw or relatively unprocessed form. Swiss chocolate companies could leverage their expertise in quality, innovation, and branding to partner with African firms and entrepreneurs to process cocoa beans into cocoa liquor, butter and powder, and even to make and market high-end finished products. Why not? There's a trade policy dimension here too. Switzerland maintains what is called tariff escalation, which discourages value-added imports in the sector. Under its tariff preference scheme for developing countries, cocoa paste and powder enter duty-free, while chocolate bars face a tariff of over 29 Swiss francs per 100 kilograms. And bulk cocoa preparations face a tariff of nearly 50 Swiss francs per 100 kilograms. Just think about this. How about if we turn this around and remove this tariff escalation so that the cocoa and the chocolate could be processed more, even if not finished, on the African continent, create more jobs, and they have the labor. You actually don't have that much comparative advantage with respect to labor. I told you I'm going to be naughty, so bear with me. Another out-of-the-box idea deals with the pharmaceutical industry, which we all love and treasure. We should look at how we can incentivize more technology and know-how transfer to the global south within the frameworks of the TRIPS agreement. I totally believe in reward for research and innovation and protection, because if you didn't have it, people would not invest for more research and more innovation. So we have to protect it. But maybe there are ways we can be forward-thinking, and I've had many conversations with the pharmaceutical industry here, Ambassador Bollinger knows. Maybe voluntary licensing approaches that can work with manufacturers in developing countries in Africa. Why should Africa import 99% of the vaccines it uses and 90% of its pharmaceuticals? Maybe it can partner with the Swiss private sector in voluntary ways, so that they are in control of what agreements they have to produce more. Actually, the WTO, the World Health Organization, and WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, we're working together to support such initiatives that take account of the sensitivities of the pharmaceutical industry, whilst also working with them to see how we can benefit developing countries. Now, finally, Swiss expertise can help lower the world's environmental footprint by assisting developing economies to leverage their green comparative advantage. I come back to that topic. Our chief economist, Ralph Osser, who is a professor at the University of Zurich, has done much to advance this concept. Just as individuals and countries can reap economic gains by specializing in what they are relatively good at, the world can reap environmental gains if countries specialize in what they are relatively green at. In other words, if countries with abundant clean energy produce more energy-intensive goods and services, whilst importing energy-light products from places where clean energy is scarce and vice versa, global emissions fall much more than they would absent that trade. Research suggests that about 1/3 of global emissions reductions could come from this kind of green comparative advantage and specialization. Picture a future in which the Global South attracts investment to harness renewable energy and process critical minerals. This would promote reglobalization, reduce emissions, ease supply bottlenecks holding back the low-carbon transition. It would also help bring Switzerland's consumption-related emissions into alignment with its low-carbon footprint at home. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me now conclude. I hope that I've persuaded you that trade continues to be an indispensable tool for improving people's lives and the health of our planet. But to make full use of this tool, we need a functional and responsive multilateral trading system. That is why our ongoing efforts to reform and strengthen the WTO need to be lifted even higher and receive appropriate political support. And I want to close with a reflection from a distinguished Swiss diplomat and later the GATT Director General, Arthur Dunkel. Speaking in 1990, he said, and I quote, "Bad trade policy decisions do damage economic activity and prospects." In the GATT, we now have a unique multilateral instrument which has persuaded and cajoled and convinced governments to do the right thing for over 4 decades, close quote. 35 years later, governments can still use the WTO as a platform to talk to each other, but more importantly, as a platform to promote prosperity for people and the planet. That's what I believe in, and I hope you do too. Thank you.
Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, thank you very much indeed for your contribution. It is an honor to have you here today. And also thank you for accepting to interact with our audience. I see that we receive many questions. I kindly ask you to come closer to me to read the questions, maybe to pick one question to answer. This is your microphone.
Why don't you pick?
Okay. So
pick whichever one you.
So maybe the first one. So the topic of this conference: what is growth? Why is there no thought of do we need growth, or is growth even possible given the current challenges? Are there any other solutions than always growing? It is a good one.
Well, I think you're asking the wrong person. You know, I'm an economist by training and a former finance minister. And I'll just say this to you. When I was finance minister and I was trying to, people were saying, oh, you know, there's a lot of poverty. And I was trying to convince them that the one way we need to get out of poverty is actually through growth. But it is not any kind of growth. It's the type of growth that really benefits people, and it's inclusive. So it's not about growth. You need growth. It's the quality of growth and the type of growth, and whether that growth is creating jobs, because you can have jobless growth. That's not what we need, because that doesn't touch people. So my answer is yes. I went on television and I took 2 cakes, and everybody thought this finance minister is crazy. What is she coming on TV to do with 2 cakes? So I took the first cake, which was a small cake that I had asked a friend to bake for me. I'm not very good at baking, but I'm good at cooking. And I said, if you're a family of 4, and this is the cake you have to share, this is fine. What if you have an additional 2 children, which people can relate to in my society? So you start with 4, and maybe you have an additional 2. And this is still the cake you have. Are you going to be better off or worse off? And it was before a live audience on TV, so everybody shouted, worse off, worse off. Because of course, you're now 6 sharing the same cake. And I said, this is why this economy must grow. What if you have a bigger cake? And I brought out the bigger cake. What will it mean for the 6 people? And everybody said we'll have much more. So my answer is, you need growth. Because if you don't grow, you'll stagnate, and it will be an ever smaller, more people sharing the same pie, so we'll have ever smaller pieces. But if we can grow the economy in a quality way, in such a way that you're growing in sectors that create jobs for people, which is why I think that Africa continuing to export raw commodities isn't going to work. It's just not going to work. We have to add value to those commodities, and this is what we are busy trying to persuade the private sector as well as leaders in Europe and elsewhere, that it is far better, instead of spending $200 million and giving it to a North African country to stop migrants crossing the Mediterranean and dying, which we also don't want, why don't you use that 200 million euros, and leverage it into a de-risking fund? Partner with an African multilateral, like the African Finance Corporation. Create a de-risking fund that will take the first loss if there's risk. And enterprises can enter because they think it's risky to invest on the continent. But that would create more jobs. That will stop young people going because they'll have work. And it's a far better use of your money than using it to take people and put them in the Sahara Desert to stop them from crossing. So this is one, again, out-of-the-box idea that I'm suggesting. So that's the answer to your question. Add value, invest, trade, grow the economy. That's the only way we are going to get out of this. Sorry.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Konji-Iweala. Thank you.